What's up, guys? Welcome to the first episode of the Medicopolis podcast, where two teenagers discuss medical dilemmas and police them to reach an ultimatum on whether the situation is ethical or not. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen, and we hope you enjoy our first episode on the ethics of euthanasia.
Since this is our first episode, we'd like to start by saying our hopes for this podcast and where we think it'll reach in the future. Our goals are to reach as many people as possible and give you a little bit more insight into what teenagers think about medical science in today's world. Let's jump in. For those of you who don't know what euthanasia is the action taken towards a patient with the intent of relieving suffering. This includes active and passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia would be like physician assisted suicide, and passive euthanasia would be things like withdrawal of medicines or withholding treatments, all with the intent of helping the patient. So, Saj, what are your thoughts and opinions about euthanasia? Do you think it's okay, or do you think it's not okay?
Yeah, I think that really the decision about euthanasia should be in the hands of the patients because the patients are the ones that are facing the physical suffering and they should be able to confer with their family and really come to a proper conclusion that's best for them, their physical health, as well as what will be best for their family's emotional. And it will give them the chance to go with dignity if they do decide to partake in euthanasia. And while yes, human life is very important to preserve, and it's the doctor's role to preserve human life and be a healer, I think that euthanasia should be really accessible for any patient who has a illness that will result in death. Ashwin, what do you think about the role of a doctor? I know I mentioned that a little bit, but I feel like a doctor's role is very important in deciding whether euthanasia should be allowed in certain areas that it isn't already.
So it's interesting that you ask me that because I think that the role of a doctor and the use of euthanasia slightly misalign in terms of what they're trying to do. A doctor's role is a healer, as you brought up, which means that they should try in their whole power to heal whatever their patient is dealing with. And with even things like terminal illnesses, that means that a physician can always try harder, can always try better to solve the solution at hand. And things like the Hippocratic Oath that many swear into as they get into their practice of a doctor or physician, where they will never give a deadly drug to anyone if asked, unless a suggestion or an attempt is made of that effort. I think that brings up the fact that a doctor shouldn't immediately try to go to the answer of, oh, physician assisted suicide is an answer. They should always try whatever they can to help the patient until their fight is done, like until either the doctor can't find a solution or until the patient is cured.
So you're saying let the patient suffer physically and the doctor doesn't really know what they're feeling because they're not in the patient's body. So you're saying that it's okay for to keep letting the patient suffer physically while the doctor just waits on the sidelines trying to find solutions half-heartedly? I mean, when does that really is that fair?
Well, I think it isn't as fair for the patient per se that they have to sit by suffering while the doctor tries to deal with the problem. I feel like it's always going to be more fair because the doctor can at least say that they tried to solve whatever is going on with the patient rather than just using active euthanasia to end the problem and relieve them of their suffering. If a doctor's job is to be a healer, they should continuously keep trying to solve that problem rather than just saying, oh, physician assisted suicide is an option. Let's just go with that because this problem is too hard for anyone to solve. And if it comes to that, then it's just going to come to physician assisted suicide.
So then what do you have to say about people like Craig Ewert, who's a 59-year-old American with motor neuron disease? And basically that's a disease that will end his life, guaranteed. There's no cure, there's no solution. What do you have to say for people like him?
Well, I think even though he's going to be suffering, the doctor should at least try. No problem is indefinitely going to be unsolvable. And by saying that it's not he's going to die immediately, that just doesn't give the doctor a chance to even try to find a solution for him before saying, oh, let's use physician assisted suicide because this is going to be the one option that you can use. And by saying that, oh, what do you think about this guy who's just going to die? I bring up the argument of palliative care, which is basically specialized care for people living with serious illnesses. If you think euthanasia is the only option, why don't we just use that for anyone who would be put into palliative care in the first place, where even if a solution maybe would be found, if by some method, using your argument, these people shouldn't even have a chance if they're in that kind of stress and suffering.
Right, but euthanasia offers the option for patients who are guaranteed to die, that it gives them the option to essentially opt out of life. And so when you keep saying that the doctor is able to research more and more and maybe try to relieve their physical suffering a little bit, it doesn't really help them out too much in the long term. And I think that overall, it doesn't really turn the tables, so to speak, and really help out the person to the point where they would want to keep living.
You actually make a pretty good point there. I'd like to bring up some other facts that might also help sway this argument. One main problem with euthanasia is the external pressures that come with it, like insurances and family and money. So one of the main problems is, especially with family, the family doesn't want the person who is in this chronic pain or this chronic suffering to end their life essentially by taking the way out. But the family wants to keep them alive, obviously, because they're in pure love with that person. What do you think could be an alternative, I guess? Do you think euthanasia could be used there, or what else do you think could be used there that would help the family and the patient cope with that problem? Because if active euthanasia seems like the only solution, then what about the family and the people they loved? What do you think? What do you think about that?
The problem with the argument you're making is that family is often conferring with the patient, talking with the patient about what they really want to do. And the family almost always, and I've not found a single example where the family disagrees with the patient. The family always agrees with their loved one because their loved one knows what physical suffering they're going through, and the family is always there to empathize with them. So, for example, with the person example that I brought up earlier, Craig, his wife decided to actively help him throughout the entire way, bring him to the care. And so I think that these loved ones really realize that their loved one is going through some hardship and it's okay that they decide to pursue euthanasia.
But there are other factors besides family that lead into whether a patient should use active euthanasia. For example, if they have financial or insurance reasons that allow them to confer to other options or not confer to other options. In this economic climate, I guess, that we're living in, it's reasonable to say that insurance companies or other people could tend to use the cheaper option, which ends up being the option that allows the patient to be in the office or wherever they're staying, to be in there for less time. So what I'm saying is, for an insurance provider where they see that active euthanasia could be the less expensive option, do you think it's fair to a patient to say, "Oh, let's just use active euthanasia because it is cheaper," versus an insurance provider saying something like, "Oh, stay in the office a little more, see if we can get a cure to this disease, or see if we can try to fix what's happening."
Well, as soon as you hear that, you know that it's the patient's need to really get help from the government and their doctor. Because it's the role of the government to help keep their citizens alive, and it's the role of the doctor to help out their patient, just as we mentioned earlier.
So then, one thing that I'd like to bring up is the idea of palliative care, which is basically specialized Medicare for people living with serious illnesses, kind of like how we're discussing right now. And the main sort of problem I want to bring up is that with palliative care, in some cases, the patient or the family won't be able to keep paying for what's happening to the patient, like how they're being treated, how they're being cared for, being provided by teams of doctors and nurses and whatever. Obviously, it's going to be important and expensive. So, when you get into some of the ideas like being able to care for the patient, being able to treat them and keep them alive, why do you think it's okay for active or for palliative care to be an option, but not active euthanasia? Why do you think active euthanasia is something that the government should immediately try to step in to help for when palliative care is already something that is a money soaker that people use today?
Well, palliative care unfortunately only provides comfort for the patient, while euthanasia is literally a matter between life and death for the patient. So they're two different scenarios. But what palliative care does, it gives the patient compassionate care and it gives them respect until their moment whether they decide to use euthanasia or not. And so palliative care, that's why so many senior citizens use palliative care, but there's not too many that decide to pursue euthanasia. So I don't think that that's too big of a financial problem.
Okay, so you're saying palliative care is more like a gateway and it leads to other options for the patient. So euthanasia is still an accepted way of dealing with it. It's just not another option to palliative care, it's another option to solution to the illness, essentially.
Exactly. I think it could be integrated alongside of palliative care.
Okay, that's a really good point.
Next, we want to mention a few examples of people whose lives have been affected by euthanasia, one of them being Dr. E. Delocht, a doctor who has received many requests from euthanasia patients that want to be relieved of their physical suffering. The doctor once quoted his patient Michel, which he said, "He thanked us as he was dying. The tears of his wife and his two sons is an image that will stay for me for a few days. Now it really hits me. Ashwin, what do you have to say about people like Dr. Lucht who feel like they're making a positive impact, as he did with Michelle?"
What I think he's doing here is very good. He's helping bring means to an end to a lot of suffering patients. But the one thing I can't appreciate is the fact that in Belgium, approximately 2,350 lives were taken by Belgian doctors. But the role of a doctor is supposed to be to heal them, to heal patients. And by seeing how many lives that these Belgian doctors are taking, even when Belgium is one of the on the more liberal side of euthanasia for the countries around the world, I feel like this is a number that's too grand. The problems that these patients are dealing with, doctors should spend their time trying to solve and fix these ideas rather than like giving active euthanasia as a means to an end. I feel like while there are some cases where this is good, there aren't 2,350 cases in Belgium where this is the right answer.
Yeah, exactly. Because as you said, Dr. Yves Delocht is a doctor who really wants to help. As he said, he, quote, wants to shorten his suffering. He provides the final care, but he doesn't feel like he's actually killing the patient, end quote. But can we really check how many people are actually on this same thought process as Dr. Yves Delocht? I don't think so. And that's a problem that we really have to consider when considering this idea of doctors' morality and their place in euthanasia.
Precisely. And I think one thing that essentially the main problem here is that while he might think he's doing good for these patients, that's not the same opinion that everyone else shares. And like I said, the role of the doctor is to provide continuous care, work with their teams, provide diagnosis and treatments. And what he's doing here is just providing a means to an end rather than thinking about the other options he could take.
Let's say that Dr. Yves Deloc lived in the United States and he really wanted to do this. Do you think that we should bend the rules for him? Because he does have a good thought process behind this.
Well, I think, well, first off, there are some places in the US that allow euthanasia. There are some states. But I think the more important point here is that by bending the rules for him, I think it still doesn't justify the fact that he could be looking at ways to treat these patients instead of just giving a means to an end. I think that also by using euthanasia, he's forgetting his Hippocratic oath, which is something that most doctors and physicians take, which directly help their job as a healer. Because the Hippocratic oath is swearing to not give deadly drugs to anyone, regardless of effects or if it'll help, which directly opposes euthanasia. But by doing this, he's directly opposing the oath that he took.
Now we want to shift over to a euthanized patient, Michael McCallum. Michael McAuliffe's dad played a huge role in his life, and especially when considering that his dad had a terminal ill disease where he ended up actually wanting to kill himself, but he didn't have the courage to do so. And this plays a huge part in Michael's choice in the end. He didn't really want to die over time. Now, in Ontario, there has been a legalization of euthanization, and there have been more than 3,300 medically assisted deaths in the province, which is a huge number.
That's why, at the age of 69, Michael McAuliffe and his family made the collective decision to have medically assisted suicide that evening. He had a party with much of his family where they all enjoyed their favorite foods and had a celebration of Michael McAuliffe's life. They all had their fair share of memories and they all said their goodbyes to Michael. One thing that Michael did before then was sit down with his wife on a long chair. And after talking, a doctor administered the substance to end his life. So this case was actually a good example of what euthanasia should be used for, since this was a good means to an end with consent from his family, and they all had time to say their goodbyes before it was his time to go. And Saj, seeing as how you're pro-euthanasia, what are your thoughts on it? Do you think that this was a good use of euthanasia? Do you think anything could have been done better? Or do you think this was overall a good experience for euthanasia?
Yeah, well, I think that Michael McAuliffe, specifically, I mentioned that his father played a big role in his choice to pursue euthanasia. And I think that there might have been some bias there, especially because his father really wanted to kill himself and he didn't want to go down that same route as his father. And while this was an amazing choice from his family's perspective and his perspective, it raises a question as to how much he was really influenced by his father, and if only he wanted to get euthanasia because of what his father thought as well. And so, while yes, I am pro euthanasia for most cases, I do think that there could be a little bit of bias here that might have interrupted his decision.
I feel like that's also a good point to bring up. But I think even with that bias, this was still a really good example because even though there was a lot of obviously there was going to be a lot of loss for McAuliffe's family, they all left on good terms, and there wasn't anything stopping him from uh, physician-assisted suicide. So what he's doing here, essentially, I think it's the best case scenario because he's able to talked with his family, get everything situated before it happens. So I think even with the bias, I think it's still a good case.
And I'd like to quote McAuliffe here. Quote, "This can be good for everybody, not the result, but the process. Being able to have choices is extremely important to me. Not to others, but it is to me." End quote. And I think that this really shows that being able to have your individual choice that affects yourself, that it comes from the help of your family, but in the end is from yourself, really. I think that's what's the most important thing here, and why he should be able to do what he chooses as long as he's not having a negative effect on others, and as long as it's really relieving his physical suffering that he does not want to go through.
So now that that's all done, Saj, what are your final thoughts on euthanasia? In my opinion, I think euthanasia isn't the best option because the role of a doctor is to be a healer, as we've discussed many times. And euthanasia, in my opinion, just doesn't do that. Even in Michael McAuliffe's case, where he was suffering and wanted to have a means to an end, I feel like there had to have been some other way to resolve the problem other than physician assisted suicide that should have been taken into account before he had this decision. Even if he was in a lot of pain, I feel like it's always the smartest option to try to discuss ways to solve the problem rather than not the cheap way out per se, but the way out that people would use for a quote chronic illness.
I'm not sure that I really agree with you. I'm pro euthanasia on a few conditions. That those being, I'm pro euthanasia for patients who have discussed the option deeply with their family and friends, and also those who have interacted with a morally upstanding doctor like Yves Delonte. Because it's very important that the people that want to get euthanized have the chance to go out with dignity and don't have that long, slow, terrible ending to their life that no one really deserves or wants to have. And it gives the chance for people's family members to remember them in a positive note as well and really allow them a mental freedom.
I guess we can agree to disagree on this one. Agreed?
Agreed.
Well, that was our first episode, so thank you guys for listening to the Medicopolis podcast. We hope you all stay tuned for next week's episode, and as well as to what is to come in the future.